So you mentioned women. Let me ask you about that. If you look at the poll numbers, they're not liking you. So how do you overcome that right now?
With the women, they want security, and they want financial security, too. If they don't go out and vote, then they have themselves to blame because they'll lose wealth.
With the midterms now 20 days out, the president, who yesterday called a woman horseface and did so publicly on Twitter, said this today, quote, college-educated women want safety, security, and health care protections very much along with financial and economic health for themselves and our country. I supply all of this far better than any Democrat for decades, actually. That's why they will be voting for me. Trump standing with women, especially those with college degrees, has been an issue since the presidential election, when he captured just 37% of that group's vote in 2016. Recent polling is showing that Trump and the Republicans have not won over a majority of women. Just 33% have given their approval of Trump. When it comes to Congress, 60% of women prefer Democrats to be in control, as opposed to 32%. A lot of numbers in there unaccounted for, of course, preferring Republicans. With us tonight to talk about all of it, Katie Rogers, White House correspondent for The New York Times, and Sabrina Siddiqui, political reporter for The Guardian. Sabrina, I want to show you something, provided you can see it there in your studio. We've put together a graphic of 17 different frames, largely the same scene. This is the Cabinet Room, West Wing of the White House. We have highlighted the lower right and colorized it for a reason. Of the 17 cabinet meetings, the only one we could find where the president is flanked by female members of his cabinet was today. Now, do you think that would have any relationship of his now famous use of the word horseface yesterday?
Well, it's certainly true that this is a president who lacks diversity in his administration, and that has extended also to the representation among women. He has a history of making comments that are insulting or demeaning toward women, often, of course, as we know, commenting on their physical appearance. And it's certainly true that to some extent it's been baked into the perception of who he is. A slim majority of white women helped propel him to the White House and voted for him despite the Access Hollywood tape in which he bragged about groping and kissing women without their consent. But now he is, of course, the president of the United States. And you do have that significant gender gap that Republicans face well into the double digits. These kind of comments, horseface, come on the heels of the very contentious Brett Kavanaugh confirmation battle, which also was polling showed women overwhelmingly disapproved of. So there is the potential for the president's comments and demeanor to exacerbate the party's problems when it comes to women voters with less than 3 weeks till the November midterms.
So, Katie, coming off the point Sabrina just made and coming off of yesterday, which we will just not consider a day of outreach to moderate voters, do you think the president, at bare minimum, can count on the voters he had in 2016 to come out in 20 days?
Absolutely. I mean, Republicans close to the president, I've talked to today, Republican pollsters, I mean, they're really making it clear that the president used the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation process to animate voters who wouldn't necessarily have come out to vote down the Republican ticket because the president was not on it. He has somehow animated voters who wouldn't have otherwise come out to say, yes, you know, I'm freaked out by what the Democrats did during the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation process. I think that the president is riding high because he knows that he can stick to this game plan of I'm only going to reach out to people who already are going to reach out to me. He's not going to be a moderating force with 3 weeks to go till this election. I think that is very clear.
So, Sabrina, what about moderates, independents?
Well, I think that it's true. The Brett Kavanaugh confirmation battle did energize voters on both sides of the aisle. But there was one survey, I believe, by the Washington Post and ABC that found 58% of women after Kavanaugh's confirmation did not think that he should have been sent to the highest court in the land. And so there is a real question as to how that might play itself out at the polls. And I think when the president continues to use derogatory derogatory terms to talk about women at this particular moment in time when Republicans would rather he stay on message, insofar as he has one single message to appeal to voters. I would be looking at those independent or even Republican-leaning women in the suburbs and whether or not those who reluctantly voted for him in 2016 now have had nearly 2 years to see that what you saw is in fact what you got, that there really was no moderating shift when it comes to the president nearly 2 years into office.
And Katie, about that building behind you, the U.S. Capitol, what about the grown-ups? What about the Republicans elected to seats in the House and Senate? Can they still be expected? Same level of support, even given what we've witnessed over the past 48, 72 hours?
Yeah, I mean, I was talking to, I talked to Newt Gingrich a couple hours ago by phone, just saying, hey, does this move the needle? Is this a political problem? I mean, Republicans will say what this president has done is unbecoming of his office. But the president, in his tweet today, reaching out to college-educated women, I mean, he has a problem. He will have a problem with them. But he is resting on a strong economy. He's resting on good jobs numbers. And ultimately, that is what Republican grown-ups, as you say, that is what is going to ring the bell for them and for their voters. And that's what their gamble is, to alienate people who might have, gone toward the middle or gone toward a more moderate, decision. I mean, he's not going to go for that. He's going to go for people who already support him.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.